Alrighty, so hello everybody. I am Siobhan on Einigh of Connacht, and this is Welsh Mythology 101 with a focus on the Mabinogi, which is the main story cycle of historic Welsh literature. So as a brief overview, we're going to discuss the format of the class. I'm going to talk about myself a little bit, and then a lot of this class is going to be me telling you these stories, because the most important thing of knowing the mythology as well, you have to know the mythology, you have to know the stories. So yes, so for starters, who am I? So as I said, I'm Siobhan Einigh of Connacht. I am an Irish Fili bard who has been training in the SCA for about 9 years as of this month. Actually, maybe even as of this week. It might be my SCA versary coming up like this week. Anyway, but the main reason why I know what I'm talking about is outside of the SCA, I have mundane training as a linguist and as an anthropologist, both my bachelor's and my master's. It's not connected to my career in any way, but I'm glad that I can still enjoy it here in the SCA. My bachelor's work in particular was primarily in Celtic historical linguistics, and amongst the other things that I studied as part of that, I studied Modern Welsh, Middle Welsh, and some Brythonic, including text reading clubs. Oftentimes was the only undergrad where we took text from Middle Welsh and we translated it into English as part of it. And in fact, I'm still confused a bit in Modern Welsh between the spellings of Modern and Middle Welsh because they're so close, with the exception of a couple things that are so different. So yes, so that's me. So yes, what is the Mabinogi? Who here has heard of the Mabinogi? You can just raise your hand. I can make this excellent. Who here has heard of the Mabinogion? Raise your hand. Anybody? Who here knew that they were different?
Say that again, please.
I said, who here knew that the two were different, the Mabinogi and the Mabinogion? So the Mabinogi is 4 branches of a loosely connected epic story cycle. Each branch has arguably 3 to 4 subparts in it. You can kind of break them up into similar sub-stories, but it's the 4 branches. And the Mabinogion is those 4 branches plus other Arthurian legends, poems, and a little bit of history and some of the law texts that we find in the extant documents. The Mabinogion is a more modern name. The earliest mentions of it, I've seen arguments of the late 1600s, but really it's you see it starting in the 1700s, and it's a combination of almost all the extant text we have out there. And on a small linguistic note, Mabinogi means son stories or child stories is how it oftentimes gets translated. Mab being son, nogi being the plural of stories. It's a plural word by itself. Mabinogion takes that plural word and pluralizes it again. So it's like you had the word stories and now it's stories-is. It's more stories. Just a little note that I find amusing. So how do we know about the Mabinogi? How do we know this? How do we know this is even a thing? There's 2 main primary texts that we have: the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hergest. Both were compiled in approximately the 1300s, mid to late 1300s, but both are believed to be pre-1100. In the terms of what it actually says through linguistic analysis, particularly E4 Williams. He's the main one who's done dating analysis on this, and his guess was between 1050 like 1030 and like 1110 maybe. Before that, it's believed to be that these came from an oral tradition, that these are stories that existed long before they were written down. And part of the reason this is believed is that it does not look like the White Book and the Red Book were written at the same time. It looks like they were probably written independently of each other, and they both happen to have the same stories, a lot of the same phrasing, and it indicates that this was probably passed down in an oral tradition through a codified set of phrases. It is prose, the majority of the text. There's a couple of poems in the Mabinogi, but for the most part, it's prose text. The Red Book of Hergest has spent most of its time with the Hopkins family before being moved to the Hergest court in the late our period, so the 1500s. And the White Book of Ridderch was commissioned by Ridderch ap Iwan Llwyd, and has bounced around a lot. The White Book is actually not in very good condition. It has split into two separate texts at some point during the history. Both of them have been bound in white. That's why it's called the White Book. And the Red Book is bound in red. That's why it's called the Red Book. The White Book is the Mabinogi plus a little bit of poetry. And parts of it were lost in history. We have documentation of some of the text that was lost through recopies, but not a lot of it. The Red Book is the Mabinogi plus, it's a much larger piece. It's Mabinogi plus history, some of the triads, Arthurian poetry, particularly Cochach ap Olwyn. A lot of the Welsh Arthurian legends that we know come from the Red Book. And then the Mabinogion that I mentioned, that's the combination of everything in those two books put together. So yes. And a lot of these stories, they're sometimes known as the Praveri cycle, because there's a character named Praveri who shows up in all of them. He's a very minor character in the second branch, and he's the first branch is his backstory. The second branch, he's off on a side quest somewhere, and the third and fourth branches, he shows up more. And his name, interestingly enough, means anxiety, which you'll find out why in just a couple moments here. Before we get into this, I do want to mention there's a couple of content warnings in some of the later branches. I will mention these content warnings again as we get to that point, but I don't want anybody to come upon them, unawares. These are historical texts, and as such, they do have some content that is not necessarily standard for a modern audience. I don't actually believe that this content would have been standard even for a medieval audience, and that it's put in there to titillate and to shock and awe, to make things interesting for the readers, or not for the in their time, for the listeners, because these were stories to entertain. We don't really have documentation as to why they were told, but my guess would be a combination of just so kind of stories where they give some moral guidance, stories of mythological creatures, and then also just ways of passing the time. They didn't have iPhones or anything, of course. They had stories, and they had people to tell them to each other. So with that being said, let's get started with the first branch. The first branch is Pwyll, Pendefig Dafydd, Pwyll, the Prince of Dafydd. And it starts with Pwyll in Annwn. So Pwyll, the Prince of Dafydd, was hunting in his lands when he sees a beautiful stag. His hounds give chase, but they can't catch it. However, he sees ahead of him a pack of white hounds with red ears, which give chase to this same fine stag as well, and they manage to bring it down. Pwyll looks around, nobody else is around, so he drives off the white hounds with the red ears, and he sets his dogs on this feast. Out from behind some trees emerges Arun, very angry. He is the lord in charge of those white dogs, and he is also the lord of Annwn, the other world. A little note here, the other world is not hell in this story, it's more the land of the Fae. You still don't want to piss them off because they have powers outside of our mortal ken. To placate Arun, Pwyll agrees to trade places with Arun for a year and a day. Each one of them would be in the guise of the other. And If he does well, if Pwyll does well by Arun in his land, Pwyll will be forgiven. But if he does not, he will pay the penalty. He doesn't really have a choice in the matter because Arun is a lord of Anun. He is a fae, and so he agrees to this. He spends a year and a day in Arun. He has many misadventures and many adventures along the way, but we're going to recount two of note. The most important one being while he was living in Anun, while he was living in the otherworld, he looked like Arun. And Arun's lady wife, well, she wanted her wifely attentions, shall we say. And it was not the done thing at the time for a man to sleep with another man's wife. That was a giant insult, even if he looked like the other man in question. So throughout that entire year, he had to continue to come up with reasons why not to sleep with his wife. The story doesn't get into the details of what they are, but I'm certain they were quite amusing. Second point of note is near the end of Pwyll's time in Anun. He is challenged by Arun's rival, Halfdan, another lord of the underworld. The two had basically split the underworld into the otherworld in two. And Pwyll, in the guise of Arun, was challenged by Halfdan for the entirety of the otherworld. And so the two meet, they fight, and Pwyll slays Halfdan with a single blow, thereby making Arun the lord of all the otherworld. Well, when Arun comes back, he's very impressed. After all, his lands have now doubled. And even more importantly to him, Pwyll kept it in his pants. He did not sleep with Arun's wife, even though the temptation was high. And with this, Arun names Pwyll a friend of the otherworld, and they both go back to their respective courts. And that is the end of the first part. Start of the second part. Sometime later, Pwyll, who is now the king of Dafydd, is riding with his noblemen, as they're wont to do, and they see a beautiful horse with an even more beautiful woman in the near distance. They all give chase. However, even though the other horse appears to just be walking along at no more than a stately pace, they can't seem to get any closer. And they keep chasing her, and they keep chasing her. And eventually the other nobles give way, their horses riding out from under them, and Pwyll is the only one following this woman. And for 3 full days he continues. And finally exhausted, his horse exhausted, Pwyll calls out to the woman, saying, "Stop, wait, please." She immediately stops, just immediately, and lets him catch up. When he catches up, he chastens her for not calling out sooner, so as to have spared both of the horses. She is Rhiannon, and she is a lady of the otherworld. The two of them fall in love, and they decide to get married. The date is set for a year and a day after the day of their first meeting. However, there is a slight catch. Rhiannon is already engaged. She is engaged to Gwal ap Llwyd. At the wedding feast, a man stands up. He looks like a beggar, and he asks Pwyll for a favor in honor of the wedding. Well, it's his wedding, and by tradition, Pwyll has to agree. So he agrees, and he agrees by saying, "I will give you anything I can that is within my power to give." The beggar then reveals himself to be Gwal ap Llwyd, Rhiannon's ex-fiancé, and asks Pwyll for Rhiannon and for the feast. Pwyll is upset, and he's in a little bit of a bind. He can't say no, not without losing his honor, not by law and tradition and custom. So he has to agree. However, Rhiannon speaks up. He can give away her, but he cannot give away the feast. The feast is hers as the bride and as the thrower of the feast. It is her feast to do as she will. And this feast has already been promised to the men. They can't give away this feast. But she agrees that she will willingly go with Gwal. And in a year and a day, there would be another feast. And at that feast, she would marry Gwal. This seems to satisfy him, and they go off. A year and a day pass, and the new feast is held. This time, Pwyll is the one at the feast, disguising himself as a beggar. And he asks his rival the same question that he was asked a year and a day before, a favor in honor of the wedding. Gwal is more clever than Pwyll and is pretty certain he knows what's going on. And he agrees to anything reasonable. Much more reasonable of a request than you can have anything within my power. And Pwyll agrees to this, and he asks for only enough food to fill his little begging bag. That's all. He just wants food to fill the begging bag. And Gwal readily agrees. I mean, why not? It's a begging bag. But unbeknownst to Gwal, this is not a normal bag. This is a magic bag, an enchanted bag that Rhiannon gave him. You see, Rhiannon is more clever than both of the men, and she is a lady of the otherworld. This bag can never be filled. It's a bag of holding. And no matter how much food Gwal shovels into this bag, it isn't full. Gwal can't make his promise. He can't meet it. And so in the end, he does the only thing that he can to keep his honor. He climbs into the bag himself. And Pwyll takes this opportunity to pull tight the drawstring and beat it with a stick until Gwal cries for mercy and agrees to withdraw his claim to Rhiannon. And that is the end of part 2. Part 3. Rhiannon and Pwyll are married to the rejoice of all the land. They're both much loved, and there's happiness and joy. However, year after year, no child is born as an heir. 7 long years. The nobles of Dyfed, they start to get increasingly worried. They love their queen, but there has to be continuation of the lineage. They finally advise Pwyll to set Rhiannon aside for a wife who can give them an heir. Pwyll is heartbroken and is ready to agree, finally. But then, surprise, good news! Rhiannon's pregnant. Yay! And in the fullness of time, 9 months later approximately, child was born. A boy, an heir. But while the queen slept with the exhaustion of her labor, the boy disappears. It's uncertain exactly how this happens. Some claim a rival paid lady in waiting to take him. Some, the boy just vanishes. But in any case, he's gone. Rhiannon's ladies in waiting, not wanting to be blamed for the loss of the heir, kill a dog and take the blood, and they smear the queen across the face with it. So she's now covered in blood, especially around the face. And when she wakes up, they claim that she fell into a vile rage after the birth, some kind of postpartum fit, and ate her child. Rhiannon and Praveri are heartbroken. Rhiannon and Pwyll are heartbroken once more. Pwyll twice over, because even though he still loved Rhiannon, he was the king of the land, and it was his job to uphold the laws and the rules, and he couldn't just let her get away with killing the heir. But due to his love, he decided to be merciful, and he decided that instead of killing her, she was to spend 7 years doing penance. She was to sit at the front gate to the castle, sitting on a block out where all passerby could see her, and she was to tell anybody coming to visit the castle what she had done. And she was to offer to carry them to the entryway on her back. She was so loved that even with her crime, very few took her up on this. In the meantime, the baby boy, who was actually alive and well, was found in the stables of one of Pwyll's lords, Tiernan. Tiernan and his wife had no children, and they had desperately wanted one, so they adopted this randomly appearing baby boy, and they named him Gwy Goldenhair. The boy grew at an astounding rate, one could even say a magical rate, and within 4 years, he had reached the size of an adolescent, of a teenager. And every day he grew, he looked more and more like the king, like Pwyll. Tiernan realized his true parentage. He realized that this child must actually be the son of the king, the missing son that had vanished 4 years earlier. And he sits his foster son down and tells him that he was a foundling, tells him he's adopted, that general story. Gwyll, who we need to remember looks and acts like a teenager, even though he's 4, decides to set off to his true home. And so he sets on his way. As he approaches the gate to Pwyll's castle at the center of Dafydd, he is met by a woman sitting on a block at the gate, who introduces herself as Rhiannon, former queen of the land and child murderer. She explains the history and offers Gwy a ride on her back up to the doors of the castle. Gwy, of course, declines, but asks this woman to walk with him as he approaches the gates. Gwy, while he's walking, tells his own life story and what his father had believed, that he was actually the son of Pwyll. Pwyll and Gwy meet each other, and it is as two sides of a mirror. There is no mistaking this child as anybody else's kid. It's Pwyll's. And since Pwyll has been faithful to his wife, so he claims, this child has to be Rhiannon's as well. That and the fact that he's only 4 years old and he's an adolescent, so clearly he has the blood of the Fae in him. Because again, that's not a normal thing. Pwyll restores Rhiannon to her place as the queen of the realm, and the family is whole once more, and the land rejoices. Gwy is renamed at this time to Praveri, the main person in the rest of our cycles, or the one who reoccurs in our cycles, which means anxiety, in honor of the anxiety he caused to everybody with his disappearance. So we're now going to take a brief pause on me telling a story so that anybody can ask questions, and we can discuss a couple of themes that show up in this story that you see running across Welsh mythology. I'm going to touch on the themes just quickly, and then we can do the questions. So for starters, the other world, Annwn. It gets translated as hell by later scholars, particularly Christian scholars, but it is not a hell in this context. It is another world. It's a Fae world. It's a she. And you'll notice that I use that translation. But if you do research, particularly on stuff from the 1800s, you might see, or from later in period, you might see this translated as hell. You see in a lot of these Welsh cycles, royals and nobles connected with the other world, with the world of the Fae, that this is part of their claim to nobility, is that they aren't fully human, that they're something else. Another thing of note, white creatures with red ears. If it's white, pure white creature, it's probably from the other world. If it's a white creature with red ears, it is definitely from the other world. Don't mess with them. Nothing good happens when you mess with those creatures. A theme that you see show up again and again and again and again and again and again and again in Welsh mythology is honor, and honor driving the law of the land. The early Welsh were one of the cultures that did have a formalized law code, the Hywel Dda, and it was driven by honor and by honor prices. If you broke your word, you would have to pay a certain amount as an honor price. If you hurt a person, you'd have to pay a certain amount as an honor price. And if you went back on your word, it carried with you. You couldn't be trusted again in that case. So you really had to be careful to keep your word in this culture. And then a final theme I'm going to touch on here is of transformation, of Praveri. In this case, it's Praveri and Arran, who trade places. They take each other's guys. And you'll see transformation coming up again and again in these stories. It's a very common theme. So yeah, like I said, we're going to take just a moment here. If anybody has questions, you can go ahead and ask. Not certain if we can unmute all, or if people can just unmute themselves. And I'm going to take a quick drink of water.
Hello. Anun, okay, is the other world.
Yes.
Okay, it's considered Fey.
Yes.
Okay, is it, are the people in the other world being Fey more powerful than the people not of the other world? Uh, being mere mortals and
So
not Fey?
it does not discuss it directly, but through implications, yes. They have the ability to transform, they have the ability to create objects that have mystical properties, like the bag. Later on, there'll be a cauldron that does some magical stuff. So it's never explicitly stated that these are more powerful, but through observation, yes, they have powers that mere mortals do not.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I see a question in the chat. Is an honor prize similar to the Weregild of the Norsemen? I'm not versed enough in Nordic law to know whether it's the exact same concept. It's probably, I know it's fairly close to the Irish honor price system. Basically, the idea is that everybody has a amount of money that they are worth based on their rank and based on their training. And if you are hurt, a certain percentage of that has to be paid out as a price. If you are killed, the entire thing has to be paid out. If you're injured and need care, there's in the Irish law code, it goes way in depth. The Huelva, I've only read portions of the Welsh code. I don't believe it goes as in depth as the Irish code, but that could just be because we don't have as much of the Welsh text as we do of the Irish. The Irish, we have a lot of that text. But yeah, so I'm not certain if that answers your question.
Well, I was going to get into another question.
Yes.
It's kind of related, okay, because the people of Anun are magical and the people not of Anun are not magical. Why does Iran trust Pwils to change places for Pwils to battle Afghan for that challenge between that challenge? Even though I know it's honor, a matter of honor, but also why would Iran, being magical, trust a non-magical to battle Iran's rival?
So we don't know that Iran knew what was going on necessarily on a day-to-day basis. It's implicated in the story that this happens very close to the end of the year and a day, and I believe that Praveri is considered a friend of the other world from there on. He doesn't have powers himself, but he's a little bit more mystical than his cohorts, and so poor. I believe it's the honor. They don't get into a lot of those details. It's just kind of, this is the story and you take it. There's some gaps in the storyline for certain.
It's in the script.
Yeah, it is because it is. All right, so I'm gonna put a pause on here, and we'll take up more questions a little later, and we're gonna get on to branch 2, which is Bronwyn Ferchlir, Bronwyn, the daughter of Lear. Minor content warning, which I will bring up again at the appropriate moments, but there is child death and there is incest mentioned in some of the later parts of this story. So if either of those are a thing, I'm gonna pause, or I'm gonna mention it at that moment. I'm gonna count 3, 2, 1, and if you want to mute me at that moment, you can. And then I will raise both of my hands like this or like this. Sorry, I'll do a thingy up like this when the content warning information has passed, because I don't want to hurt anybody with that story. Okay, so part 1 of this is the wedding of Bronwyn. Bendigeidfran is also known as Bron the Blessed, and he is the son of the sea god Lear. He was crowned High King of all of Britain, all of the Isle of the Mighty, with his main court at London. One day, while visiting his court at Harlech with his brother and sister, 13 ships appear on the horizon, coming from the south of Ireland. The ships flew the flag of peace. Well, it's actually a shield. It's the shield with the triangle bit pointed up. And it was Matholwch, king of all of Ireland, the High King of Ireland, who wished to wed Bronwyn, who was herself sister to the king and daughter of Lear, sea god. Bron took counsel. He took counsel with his nobles, the men of the land. He took counsel with his brother Manawydan, and he took counsel with his sister Bronwyn herself, of course. And they all agreed that this would be a very good match and this would make a very strong alliance. So a wedding date was set and a feast was held and all were merry. Well, almost all were merry. Einigh, half-brother of Bron and Bronwyn and Manawydan, the child of a different father, not the child of the sea god, he was not merry. He had not, in fact, been consulted about his sister's marriage, and it angered him. It angered him a lot. He felt this was an insult to his honor as a noble. And in his anger, at the wedding, he went into the pavilion where all of Matholwch's prize horses were kept. And he sliced at all of them. He cut off their ears, he cut off their lips, he cut off their tails, and he ruined their legs. And in the morning, Matholwch and Bronwyn rose for the first time as man and wife, and the Irish king was informed of what had been done. He stormed to Bron in a rage and in confusion. First, he was given the fairest and most clever maiden of the land as a wife to bind the two lands together. And then this insult was done by the brother of the king, even if he was a half-brother, he was still a brother. Bron tried to calm him, tried to offer recompense. He tried to offer a full prize healthy horse for each that was ruined, plus a silver for each of those horses, plus a gold on top of all of that as an honor price. But Matholwch was having none of it, and he stormed out, and they took off down the road. Bron didn't want to leave it there. It didn't look good on him. It wasn't good on his honor, and it would ruin the new alliance. So he sent messengers after Matholwch. He decided to better the offer, to maintain the peace and to maintain the friendship. He would add to all of that a magic cauldron from the other world. The cauldron seemed ordinary enough to look at, basic, large, plain porridge pot, but any corpse placed in the cauldron would the next day emerge a healthy, living man, no worse the wear. Matholwch considered, and he agreed. In addition to the horses and the gold and the silver and all that, like that wasn't refused, that came with. And he returned to Ireland with his bride, satisfied with this price. Part 2, the rescue of Bronwyn. There's a content warning at the end for child death. I'm, as I mentioned, going to count backwards in case you want to mute me at that point. So upon reaching Ireland, Matholwch and Bronwyn settled into married life, generally happy. A year after the wedding, Bronwyn gives birth to a son who is fostered in a fine family, as is the way of things in Ireland, and things generally seem well. However, throughout that entire first year, word starts to go out and starts to trickle in amongst the people of Ireland, and they hear of the insult that Einigh paid to their king, ruining those prize horses of Ireland. And they increasingly grow hostile to Bronwyn, and they increasingly get angry. It starts out very small with words and glances, but over the course of 3 years, it gets worse and worse until she is being beaten daily, being forced to live with the servants and being forced to work as a servant. All of her outgoing mail was stopped, and eventually a general embargo is placed on all traffic out to Wales so that she can't get word back to her brother, King of all Britain, and so that no one would know what's being done to her. But Bronwyn was clever, and she didn't give in to despair. She took a baby starling from a nest that was bred outside the window of the kitchen where she was working, and she raised it in secret. How she raised a bird in secret, we don't know, but she raised it in secret. And she taught it human speech, and she taught it how to recognize people, and she taught it directions. And when it had finally grown enough, she wrote a letter describing everything that had happened to her since she had left the Isle of the Mighty, and she tied it to the bird, and she sent it to her brother in Wales. The bird flew straight to Wales, to quote someone much punnier than I, thus Twitter was invented. Thank you, Carrion. And it flew straight to the court of Bendigeidfran, Bron the Blessed, and it delivered the missive to him. And upon reading it, Bron's anger grew tenfold at the mistreatment of his sister, and through her, the insult done to all of Wales and to all of the Isle of the Mighty. He gathered men from all 154 countries, from all 154 regions, with the plan to raise down all of Ireland. And he decided he was going to lead this himself, even though he was not himself a warrior. He was known as a counsel giver and a wise man, but he decided to lead, he had to lead this himself. And so he left a council of 7 elder nobles in charge, and he set forth, along with his brother Mabinogi and with Pwyll Lord of Dafydd and with a whole host with him. Matholwch, however, was not without his own spies, and he drew forth an army of his own. The two hosts met in battle at the beaches of Ireland, and great damage was wrought on the countryside. However, Ireland could not stand against Bron's wrath and slowly had to give way. Therefore, more and more of the countryside was razed. Bronwyn was horrified at the damage being done in her name, and even though the people of the land had not been welcoming to her, she didn't wish to see them harm. And so she went to her king and begged him to submit. He couldn't win, and in losing, everybody would lose on the island. At this point, Matholwch had lost enough and hadn't seen enough damage done to see this wisdom, and realized that he couldn't best Bron's host in a one-on-one combat. So he listened to his wife's counsel, on the face of it at least, and sent messengers to Bron offering peace. He offered to build a great hall in Bron's honor, large enough to fit all of Bron's fighters and all of Matholwch's fighters as well, and to pay him homage. And as a sign of this, the child that he had with Bronwyn, the son, would be raised on high as the future king of both Ireland and all of Britain. And Bron is a pretty trusting guy, and he agrees because he wants to see peace. So the hall is built, and the first feast date is set for the very first feast to open up this hall. And sure enough, this is large enough for all the fighters. Efnason, however, who had come along with the host, wasn't as trusting as his half-brother. He snuck into the hall ahead of the army and ahead of the host and ahead of everybody else, and he sees that bags are placed along each of the columns, hundreds of them. And he asked the servants, well, what are these bags? And they say, oh, it's flour and food so that we can be certain to properly entertain. And he sticks his hand inside the bag and feels around, and there's a head. That's not food. And so he goes around to each of the bags and he squeezes them, and he squeezes the heads, and he kills all the men who were hiding for the trap. And so the feast commences. They don't mention if Efnason tells about this trap, but it's been disarmed. So in any case, the feast commences. And Bronwyn's son, whose name is Gwern, is put in place of honor at the sign of their alliance. So this is the point which, if you want to mute, you might want to mute. That is 3, 2, 1. Continuing on, Efnason is still very angry about the insults that he believes that the Isle of the Mighty has been given by this alliance, by the trap, and so he calls his nephew to him. And Bronwyn, not thinking anything is wrong, sends the boy, says, yes, go, please, play with your uncle. And when Efnason gets hold of the boy, he declares that the alliance must be broken, even if it came at the worst price possible in the culture. And he throws the boy into the fire. Yeah. So if you want to unmute me, this is you're good now. So because of the thing I just talked about, battle immediately breaks out. And the Irish kindle a fire under the magic cauldron of revival to use it and to continue to push out the Welsh. And in the morning, new waves of Irish come forth, and they're now overwhelming Bronn's forces. And Bronn himself is mortally wounded. Efnason, looking around at this, seeing his kinsman dying, seeing all this carnage, and he knows that he's the cause of it because of his act. Both the first acts that insulted Matholwch in the first place and his kinslaying. He hides amongst the Irish dead and jumps in the cauldron as a living person, which destroys it. It also destroys him in the process. And that's the end of part 2. Part 3, after the battle, only 7 men survived out of all of Bronn's forces. They returned to the Island of the Mighty on the ships, but once they are within sight of the coast, Bronwyn's heart breaks and she dies. She had lost her son, she had lost her husband, even though he hadn't necessarily treated her the best, and 2 great lands were in ruin for her sake. 3 of the survivors, Manawyddan, who's the brother of Bronn, the bard Taliesin, and the Prince of Dyfed, Praveri, the son from the last one, they attend the dying Bronn, the king of the island. He orders the men to cut off his head and to return with it to the court of Harlech, where this all started. And they do this. And for 7 years, Bronn's head continues to give them counsel and wise advice, just as a head on a pike. After the 7th year, Bronn tells them to open the door to Gwales in Penfro, where they will reside in peace and happiness, so long as a second door at Cornwall remains shut. And the 7 survivors do this, and they go to Gwales, and they remain there for 80 years in timeless bliss. They lack for nothing, not food, not water, and they did not remember any of their griefs or sorrows that had ever occurred in their life while they were there. Until one day, one of the men, Highland Fap Gwyn, opens the other door, the one facing Cornwall. He had forgotten why they were not supposed to open it. And in the opening, they remembered all that they had lost. During these 80 years, Bronn's head had fallen silent. It had run out of its magic at last. And so it was buried on the White Hill, which mundanely is believed to be where the Tower of London is, facing France to ward off invasion. Content warning, gonna count back down again. 3, 2, 1. And aside before we move on, the story goes that while only 7 men from the Isle of the Mighty survived the battle, no men survived on the Irish side, and there were only 5 pregnant women left. All 5 of the children were sons who had to repopulate the entire island with the only women available, their mothers. And thus did they repopulate the entirety of Ireland, each in one region, all of their descendants from one line. And that is the second branch of the Mabinogi. Oh. Now this quickie bit is done. So themes again. So we have the other world again showing up. We have Bron's wisdom and magic. He survives as a head on a pike for 7 years, plus whatever time they were in Gwales. You have the cauldron that can bring people back to life. We have Praveri again, a very small role, but yeah, he does show up. We see mentioned here a thing that shows up in a couple of other Welsh sagas where only a few are left alive at the end. In particular, this is also seen in I Gododdin, which is a poem that I perform sometimes, where most of the people are killed and there's only a couple left alive. And then again, we see women being clever. You don't see women in battle very often here, but you do see them coming up with clever ideas. So we're just going to take a couple questions at this point. So I'm a little concerned on time and I'd like to get through all 4 stories, but I also need a drink.
Is there a significance to the number 7?
Not that I know of. We see 3 more often in Celtic mythology. But I mean, 7 is a fairly common secondary number. Yeah, I'm not entirely certain. 3 shows up a lot though, so very much to the point that there's an entire form called triads, which you see them both in Irish things and in Welsh, where it's basically just 3 things listed, and they probably had some significance, some meaning. It was probably something that you could say to like remind of a whole story, but we just have lists of 3. Alrighty, so now we're going to go into branch 3, which is Manawydan, son of Lear. This is the brother of Bron and Bronwyn from the previous story. He's the only one still alive. And so in the aftermath of Bron's death and the burial of his head, after the 80 years that were spent in Gwales, Manawydan finds that the kingship of the Isle of the Mighty has been passed to another in his absence, to a cousin, even though he would nominally be next in line as the brother of the former king. I don't blame them. He was gone for 80 years. Yeah, they don't mention that bit. Praveri, who had also been in Gwales, he seeks to soothe his friend's qualms by inviting him back to his land, to the land of Dyfed, and the 2 of them set forth. There, Praveri reunites with his lovely wife, Kikfa. Again, they don't mention the whole 80 years gone thing. And his mother, Rhiannon, the otherworldly lady from the very first story. And a great feast is had at Praveri's return, and there is much, much joy. And throughout this entire feast, Manawydan is seen to fall in deep conversation with Rhiannon, with the words flowing as freely as the wine, and it appears to all who are watching that love is in the air. And Praveri looks upon his friend and his mother doing their little chatty, and he approves. And he approaches his mother. He would like the 2 of them to wed, because she is a widow and he is his best friend. Rhiannon agrees gladly, and Manawydan, for his part, calls for God's blessings upon Praveri for having such a friend as this. And so the wedding was had, and there was hunting and feasts and good days. But we're not interested in the good days, because those aren't as interesting. In time, a great storm crossed the land, and it left a strange mist that seemed to wither all it touched. No one could see beyond their fingers. It was a storm that came out of nowhere. No one had seen it coming. But in the morning, it lifted. The sun came forth, it burned off the mist, and it left, well, nothing. Praveri and Manawydan searched the hall, and then they searched the castle grounds, and then they looked in the surrounding fields, and no one was left. Not a man, nor a beast, nor even a stalk of grass. There was nothing there except them and their 2 wives. And they weren't able to live in this manner. So the 4 of them set off towards the center of England to make their living. They first stop in Henford, where they decide to take up saddle making, each of them doing part of it. And their saddles were the best that could be found in all of the land. They were colored, they were even colored azure. They were even colored blue, special secret color, which very few knew how to make. And no one could match their craft. And the crafters, in anger, drove them out of Henford. So they travel on to the next city, where they decide to take up shield making. And their shields are the best that can be found in all of the land. And they are even colored in blue, secret color that so few knew how to make, and none could match their craft. And once again, the crafters were angry, and they drove them out of the city in anger. And so thus they continued on one city further, and here they took up shoemaking. They didn't know as much about shields, or about shoes. They knew more of shields and saddles. And so they figured this might be a little bit safer. But they gathered up the finest leather in the land and the finest metal for the buckles. And again, they have that azure thing going on, that color that so very few can perfect. And within a very short time, none could match their shoemaking. And all the crafters from all the surrounding cities gathered together, and they decided and agreed that these outsiders must die. It's the only way. Their crafting is just too good otherwise. So Praveri and Mabinogi and Cigfa and Rhiannon, getting the hint that maybe they're not entirely wanted, decide to leave England, the center of England, and slowly travel back to Devon. And so they spend a year on the road as they go, and they gather together a band of dogs to hunt with. They have, it's alluded that they have adventures. We don't get to know what they are. And they generally make their way slowly. And one day, the group comes across a giant boar, stark white, and Praveri and Mabinogi give chase with the dogs. The boar quickly runs away, and the two men follow up hill and down, up and down. They come to a fort, stark and towering in the middle of the land, nothing else around it. And Mabinogi paused. He's not getting a good feeling about this thing. But Praveri laughs off these misgivings. He has a little bit of his father's sense of wisdom, and he continues on inside. And the place was all one room, nothing inside except a golden bowl in the very, very center, shiny, filled with water. And Praveri was drawn to it as in a trance. He comes forward and he touches it, just one hand. And in that moment, his feet glued to the floor, his hand, they say hands, so somehow the second hand gets on there, hands tight to the bowl, and his mouth is glued shut. And Mabinogi, waiting around outside the fort, waits, and the sun goes down, and his friend doesn't come out, and he doesn't want to go in that fort. So he turns around, he returns back to the two women waiting in camp, and tells them what happened. And his wife, Rhiannon, yells at him a little bit and says, "How you're a strong warrior. Why would you leave your friend in such a place without even knowing what happened?" And she storms off, and she goes to the fort. And she enters it, even though she's a clever one normally, but she enters it. Her son's in there after all. And she sees her son, and then she sees the bowl, and it's gold, and it's shiny, and it's filled with water or something. She walks up to it, and she touches it, and she too is frozen in place, her feet frozen to the ground, hands frozen on the bowl, mouth glued shut. And in a sudden blanket of mist, the fort vanishes, and it takes the two of them with it. Cigfa and Mabinogi weep. Both of their spouses have suddenly vanished now, but they really don't know what else to do. I mean, they aren't people of magic themselves. And so they try to return to England. They try to take up crafting again, but they anger the craftsfolk again. And so again, they get driven out. They have to stay in Duffin, and they have to figure out how to live there. There's really no other options. And so they decide to settle down and try to farm the land, even though it's still blighted from the first mist. And so Cigfa and Mabinogi sow 3 crofts of wheat, 3 fields of wheat, about a day's ride apart. And each field grows overnight until it's tall and gleaming, and beautiful. And Manawyddan decided he would harvest the first in the morning. But in the morning, the first field was destroyed. All the wheat was gone. Everything was laid bare. And he couldn't harvest it. Manawyddan raged, but there really wasn't anything to be done again. I mean, he has magic seeds somehow, but he himself is not an enchanter of any kind. So he travels to the second field, and he sees that it is also full grown and ready to be harvested. But it was now nearing dark, and so Manawyddan decided he would harvest first thing in the morning, get a fresh start with the day. But in the morning, the second field is also destroyed in the night. And so he rages again. And he is raring to go, and he's pissed off. So he travels to the third field. It's dusk again when he arrives. But this time he decides he's not going to sleep. No, he's gonna stand right there. He's going to watch that field. He's going to find out what's destroying his wheat. And so he does. He stays up all night. And just as the moon starts to rise, he sees a rustling in the wheat. And he sees it's mice. But not a normal amount of mice. No, it's hundreds and hundreds of mice, all gnawing at his wheat and stealing it. And in a rage, he chases them, and he tries to catch them, and they're small, and they move fast, and finally, he catches one of the bloody things. He takes off his glove, and he sticks the mouse in his glove. And he's going to make that mouse pay, because that mouse stole his wheat. He goes back to Kigva, takes that glove with him, and he declares he's going to hang this mouse because that mouse is a thief. That's what you do to thieves. And so the next morning, as soon as dawn comes up, he goes to the top of the highest hill where all can see, and he prepares the gallows. And as he sets down the base of the gallows, a scholar in rather worn clothing approaches him. This is the first person that he had seen outside of his friend and their wives in 7 years. And he hasn't even seen his wife or his best friend for at least a year. And they ask, the scholar asks the king, what are you doing? Manawyddan decides to oblige him and explains that he was hanging a thief and shows in the glove that it's a mouse. The scholar begs the king to let the mouse go, and he offered the meager pound that he had collected as alms in return. Manawyddan refused. This was a thief. This was the mouse that ate his wheat. That's not happening. And the scholar leaves. And then continues working on it, and just as he's raising the gibbet, just as he's getting that last piece of wood up there, a priest comes up the hill and asks, what are you doing? Manawyddan explains that he is hanging a thief, and then again displays the mouse to this randomly appearing priest. The priest again begs the king to let it go. This time he offers £3 from the church box, all the money the church has collected, to do so. Manawyddan thinks about it for a moment and then refuses. This is a thief, and this thief is going to pay the price. And the priest leaves. And Manawyddan continues to work on his hanging thing. Words, they're failing me. And just as he finished tying the rope, just as he finished slipping the loop over the neck of the mouse, a bishop came up the hill in all of his finery and asked the king what he was doing. And Manawyddan explained again, just like the first two. And just like the first two, the bishop begged to let it go. And he kept begging. First he offered £7, then he offered £24, then he offered all the horses in the land, and Manawyddan did not accept any of them. He didn't need money, didn't care about money, and as far as he knew, there were no horses to be found in the land. He just wanted to kill the thief that ate his wheat. And the bishop begged him, got down on hands and knees and said, set your price, anything to save this mouse. And Manawyddan declared that the only prize he would accept was the return of his friend Praveri, his wife Rhiannon, and the restoration of the land of Dafydd. And the bishop hung his head and agreed. He explained that he was not just the bishop, he was also the priest. He had also been the scholar. And in fact, he is an enchanter named Llwyd ap Cilcoed. And he is the one who had set that withering mist and had called that horrible storm 7 years prior as vengeance for his friend Gwal ap Clwyd, Rhiannon's first fiancé, way back in that first branch. And he had transformed his own retinue, his own people, into mice to destroy the crops the first night and the second night. But when his wife was caught on the third night, he couldn't remain silent. Llwyd promised that there would be no vengeance on Manawydan or his group in return for his wife, and Praveri and Rhiannon were returned from the land of the mist. True to his word, the people, the beasts, the crops, everything came back from the land of the mist. Dafydd was restored just as if those 7 years had not happened. And this is the end of the third branch. So again, we see themes of transformation. We see people being turned into animals. Again, we see gaps in a narrative storyline that a modern audience would question quite strongly, but are just kind of glossed over in the Welsh text. We see, again, this concept that nobles are inherently better, that they're maybe blessed by magic, blessed by God. You see more religious speech in this third branch, and they're not 100% certain whether that was original or whether that was inserted. It's a little more obvious when it's inserted in the poetry, because it's a lot harder to alter the poetry than it is to alter the prose. The prose withstands it a bit better. And then again, you see a touch of the other world with the white boar. They don't have red ears this time, but you definitely see this. It's a white critter, and then magic is afoot. Weird stuff is afoot. All right, so we're going to take a couple moments for questions and for a very important content warning before we get on to the fourth branch. Nothing? Okay. So the fourth branch, the last branch, is Math fab Mathonomwy, Math, son of Mathonomwy. And this entire branch is very problematic from a modern audience. Heck, it was probably very problematic at the time. Think parts of, what was that popular show? Game of Thrones. Think like Game of Thrones level stuff. There's sexual assault, there's incest. It happens a lot. So if this is something that's not going to be your cup of tea, you might want to go ahead and mute me or even just drop off. This is the last of the four branches. And while there may be questions and discussion at the end, yeah, this entire section is going to be a problem if that's the case. I will do a thumbs up at the end of the branch, but it's not going to get better basically until the very end. Okay. So with that being said, I'm going to count down from 5 this time. 5, 4, 3, 2, excuse me, 1. And now do we start the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. And now do we go to the court of Math, king of Gwynedd. This guy hasn't shown up before. This land hasn't shown up before. Most of the rest of this was based around Dyfed or Ireland. This is now Gwynedd, is the mainland. And Math, for reasons unknown and unexplained in this story, had a curse laid upon him. His feet must always be held in the lap of a virgin during a time of peace, or else he will die. If he's ever sitting down during a time of peace, his feet have to be in the lap of a virgin. And Gwyn is declared to be the most beautiful woman in all the land, and she is a virgin, and she is tasked with doing this. And so she sits at the feet of the king and holds his feet in her lap. And Gilfaethwy, Math's nephew, visits his uncle at the court, and he falls in lust, let's say. I'm hesitant. It gets translated as falls in love by most people, but I'm going to say falls in lust. And he pines away at the thought of this woman, thought of Gwyn, and he can't be satisfied, not by food, not by drink. He can't sleep all day. He's just wasting away. And his brother, Gwydion, who is widely regarded as a clever man, a sly man. He knows things about things, and he recognizes the cause of his brother's waning, and he reassures his brother that he's going to do whatever he can to set things right for him, no matter what it takes. Gwydion has a plan. He goes to Math, the king, and he extols a new animal that is that's showing up in the south. Pigs. Small hogs. Not like the large boars that roam the forest and are dangerous to everybody and frankly are the villains in a lot of the Irish legends. No, these are pigs. Small, manageable, and from the other world. Their meat is so succulent and so moist. It causes the bards to sing, and they are owned by Praveri, the king of Dyfed, the land just to the south. And they were given to him by the Lord of Annan, by Anfon, his father's friend. And Gwydion asked the permission of Math to go to Praveri and ask for some as a gift to the kingdom, as a gesture of good faith, being good neighbors. Math likes the sound of this. And so he gives permission. He says, yeah, go ahead. This is a good idea. And so Gwydion sets off for Dyfed. And he does so in the guise of a bard. He guests at the court of Praveri, and he tells tales, and he entertains to rival the pencairths, to rival the head bards, for all that he did not actually have the training of a pencairth. And he made certain to emphasize his relationship to his uncle Math, the king of the land to the north. And Praveri, pleased by all this, asks what he could give his guests to please him. And Gwydion asked, well, I'd like some of those pigs, please, the ones that I hear so much about. Oh, why is my magical device is making a noise. It should not. Okay, quiet magical device now. So yes, Gwydion asks for the magical pigs. And Praveri's in a little bit of a bind. You see, he had promised Anfon, Lord of Annan, that he would not give away nor sell any of the pigs until they had been with him for a set number of years, and that set time had not passed yet. And so he could not agree to give these pigs. Was there anything else? Sly Gwydion said he didn't have anything else, but give him a day to prepare, and he knew a way around this thing. He was just give him a day. Give him a day. Praveri agrees, and Gwydion goes off for a day. And then he comes back with fine horses and the best dogs to trade for the pigs. It's not selling and it's not giving, it's trading equal value for equal value. And Praveri agrees. This won't break his word with the Lord of Annan. And as soon as the trade is done, Gwydion sets back off to Gwynedd in a hurry. With a very important reason. Praveri soon discovered that a ruse had been played. The horses and the dogs were mere enchantments and turned to dust upon the next dawn. In the meanwhile, Gwydion abandoned the pigs and rushed back to the court of Math with news. All of Dyfed was mustering against Math. They would not give the pigs, and they were affronted by the asking. Math declares war at this insult and decides he's going to go claim the pigs himself if they would not be given freely. And therefore, Gawain is allowed to pause from her duties as footbearer because they're in a time of war, and so Math won't die if his feet are not in the lap of a virgin. And so he rushes off with his armies. The very night that Math left, Gilfuthwy took Gawain by force. And it is implied that this happens more than once, and Gwydion joins in. So, Math and Praveri's armies fight to a standstill, and it was decided that the battle would be concluded by single combat. One man had started this fight, Gwydion. By this point, they've realized that this is all Gwydion's fault, and they decide that now one from each side would end it. Math and Praveri met alone on the field, and only Math walked off. The armies of Dyfed returned south to mourn their king, Praveri. And Math returned back in turn to the court of Gwynedd. He called for Gawain, who approached. He wanted her in place before he officially declared that peace had been made, and asked for her to sit. She refused. She advised him that a new footbearer would now be needed. She was now a woman. And Math asks why. She explained that this was done by the force of Gilfethwy and Gwydion, and it happened on the king's own bed. Math's just a little bit pissed, just a bit. And he promises justice for Gawain, especially for herself, mostly for her, but also for himself, because that was his bed. And he decreed that due to her service and her loyalty, that he would marry her and make her queen over all the land in recompense for this injustice and for the fact that he was not able to adequately defend her, because she was a vassal of his. And arrest warrants are sent out, and Gilfethwy and Gwydion are brought before the king by force. Math recounts all their wrongs to the entire court, and he starts with the lies, the conniving, breaking his trust, the death of his warriors in the war, the death of the warriors of Dyfed, the death of King Praveri, who had done nothing wrong in the end, and worst of all, raping his now wife. They were in just a bit of trouble. And he declared war on them. He told them that no punishment would adequately repair the wrongs that they had done, but he could at least give a start. And with that, he took a magic wand that he had, and he struck each brother on the shoulder. Gilfethwy turned into a she-deer, a hind, a female deer, and Gwydion turned into a stag. He ordered them to live for a year and a day, as animals would, and to bear offspring, as animals would, even though they were brothers. And a year and a day later, a stag, a hind, and a fawn entered the court. Math struck the adults with the wand again, and now Gwydion was a sow, and Gilfethwy was a boar. He ordered them so to live for a year and a day, as the animals would in nature, even bearing offspring, as the animals would in nature. However, as the boar and the sow were led out, he touched the fawn lightly with the wand, and it turned into a red-haired boy, who was baptized Hithwan. A year and a day later, a sow, a boar, and a piglet entered the court. Math struck the adults with the wand, and now Gilfethwy was a wolf bitch, a she-wolf, a female wolf, and Gwydion was a wolf. And he ordered them so to live for a year and a day, as the animals would, as in nature, and even to bear offspring, as in nature. The piglet, however, he touched very lightly with the wand, and it turned into a tall boy. He was baptized Hithdan. And a year and a day later, the she-wolf, the wolf, and a cub enter the court. Math touched the cub lightly with a wand, and it turned into a sturdy boy. He was baptized Blevin. Math then decreed that the punishment of Gilfethwy and Gwydion was enough, having been transformed thrice, having borne offspring together thrice, and returned them to being men, and declared peace. Now that peace was here again, he needed another virgin footholder to appease his curse before he can sit down. Gwydion suggests his sister and Math's niece, Arianrod. The young woman agrees, and she swears that as far as she knows, she's a virgin. She swears this up down to God Almighty. But Math decides to test her to be sure. He has to know for certain, because otherwise he will die. And so he commands her to step over a stick, and he lays down the magic wand. She hasn't seen the rest of it. This is just a stick. And she does as she is told. After all, this is just a stick. How could it tell? And immediately as she steps over it, she goes into labor pains. She was not, in fact, a virgin. She birthed a very large boy with curly yellow hair, and she runs for the door in tears. Something further dropped from her as she fled, probably the placenta, and Gwydion picked it up and wrapped it in silk. Math had the boy baptized as Dylan, and he went to live in the sea and ends up being the Prince of the Sea. That night, Gwydion hears cries from the chest that he put in the wrapped silk with the bit that had fallen from Arnrod afterwards, and it had turned into yet another baby boy. It is believed this is a very roundabout way of saying that Gwydion raped his sister and that this child was the product. So, a few years later, Arianrhod had settled a castle for herself. She had her own lands, she had her own castle, Caer Arianrhod, and she had a number of vassals. And one day, Gwydion appears, accompanied by the boy from the chest, who's now 5 or 6. He presents the boy as his son and as Arianrhod's. Furious and shamed, she places a tinged on the boy, a curse, very similar to the Irish concept of a geish, but this is the Welsh version. And the tinged is that only she could give this boy a name. Gwydion is furious and curses her to God and leaves with the child. He enchants himself to look like a cobbler and claims to be the best in the land. He enchants the best in the land. Arianrhod hears of this and places an order for shoes. He makes one pair, it's too big. He makes a second pair, it's too small. He finally declares he can't make a proper set of shoes without seeing the lady's feet. And so Arianrhod comes to the seeming cobbler. She does not know this is Gwydion after all, he's enchanted. Comes to the seeming cobbler and has her feet measured. And while her feet are being measured, she watches his fine son throwing stones at a wren and claims the fair one strikes it with a skillful hand. And the boy was thus named Llw, skillful hand. She had been tricked. Furious at being tricked, she curses the boy again. She lays another tinged. Llw would never receive weapons or armor unless he received them from her directly, and she leaves. Gwydion then enchants himself and the boy as strapping young men at arms, and he enters the castle and enters into the hall. And in this guise, they lived for a few days, for a little while, until they gained the trust of the lady of the castle, Lady Arianrhod. And then Gwydion worked further enchantments, taking the mist and turning it into an entire army of ships that was attacking the castle. There was no time to waste. They had to take up arms. They had to defend the land. And Gwydion bade Llw to go to Arianrhod, which he did. He would help defend the keep, but he had no armor. He had no weapons. And so Arianrhod armed him from her own stash with her own hands and gave weapons to him. And with that, Gwydion banished the attacking armies back into the mist they were made of, and she had been tricked again. And furious, again, she cursed the boy for a third time. He would never have a wife, not from any land in the world, not from any race, not from any culture. He would never have a wife from any woman currently born. Gwydion curses her unto God and leaves with Llw. And he goes back to Gwynedd and takes counsel with Math to complain of Arianrhod and to find a solution so that Llw can have a wife. And Math agrees because it's not the boy's fault that all of this is going on, really. It's Gwydion's, but for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to be angry at Gwydion anymore. And so Math bids his retainers to bring flowers. And flowers are brought and they're arranged in the shape of a woman. And Math touches them with his wand and they become the most beautiful woman that had ever been seen. She was baptized Blodwyd, flower face, and she was married to Llw that very same day. And Math gave them the best of all of his contrafts, the best of all of his lands as a gift. But in time, Blodwyd learned more of the world, and she grew tired of the husband that she had been literally created for. And so she started seeing Gron Pebir, the lord of the neighboring land, and the two of them fell in love. But they knew they could never be together while Llw, her husband, still lived. Llw had been his mother's curse, but he had also gotten some blessings in the deal with his unnatural birth. Oh yeah, I don't need to say at this point, he's an adult at this point. And so Blodwyd knew that he couldn't be killed by any normal means. He couldn't be killed in the day or the night, indoors or outdoors, neither riding nor walking, not clothed, not naked, nor by any weapon lawfully made. Seemingly, he was unkillable. But in the quiet times of the bedchamber, Blothwyd spoke to him, and she whispered to him, and she feigned worry and concern for her lord husband, and in time she discovered the means to end him. He could be killed only at dusk, wrapped in a net, with 1 foot in a cauldron and 1 foot on a buck, with a spear forged for a year and a day during the hours that everyone else was at mass. And thus did Blothwyd and Rhona arrange it. They had to wait for the spear the longest. It took a year and a day after all. When the spear was finished, she came to her husband while he was bathing with a buck, while he bathed by the stream at dusk. And she bade him show her how one could even balance on a buck with 1 foot in a cauldron. I mean, she just wanted to be certain this couldn't be done, right? And she just wanted to appease her mind. Llw laughs at her and obliged, balancing on the cauldron that was used for his wash water with 1 foot, and on the buck with another. And in that moment, Blothwyd tosses a net on him, and Gron strikes with a spear, and it's poison tipped for good measure, something that was not actually in the original recipe. Llw lets out a cry and flies up, and he changes into a giant eagle, probably because the poison wasn't in the original recipe. He flew and flew and flew, and he lived as an eagle for quite some time. Gwydion heard that he was missing and started searching for the lad. The two, Blothwyd and Gron, had claimed that he was killed in an accident and took the lands and were living as husband and wife, but Gwydion didn't believe him. Finally, he came upon this giant eagle, and by his craft, by his power, he knew it was Llw. He sang a song, an Englyn poem, and he turned the Llw, and he called the Llw eagle down onto his arm, where he used his magic to turn it back into a man. The two return to Gwynedd, and Llw is nursed back to health. He takes the armies of the land, and he reclaims his land from the traitorous couple, and those two were now wed, but yeah, he reclaims his land. Blothwyd is turned into an owl, claimed to be hated by all other birds, but always to retain the flower as a face, the white moon face. Gron escapes for a time, but he gets tired of being hunted, and he sends messages begging forgiveness. Llw agrees, but only on the condition that Gron take a blow from his spear in return for the blow that he had been given. Gron doesn't like this plan. Llw is quite skilled with arms, and he asks all of his men, all of the lords under him, will anyone please take this for me? And none of them are willing to do this. It's his fault. Sorry, you're on your own, dude. And so finally, Llw agrees to allow Gron to place a large stone in between them to shield the blow, because Gron only blew through his blow because of the misleading of Blothwyd. It doesn't matter. It doesn't do any good. Llw throws the spear. It goes straight through the stone, big hole in it, and straight into Gron, and it kills him. Llw becomes the ward of the king, and in time, he ascends to the throne of Gwynedd. And that is the end of the fourth and weirdest branch. I don't like the fourth branch. Anyway, we only have a couple minutes left, but if anybody has any quick questions. Oh, yeah. Anybody who was sticking around throughout the fourth branch of horribleness, it's safe to listen now. Questions, comments, concerns? Themes. We again see lots of transformation. This is the one with the most magic in it, arguably. Lots and lots and lots of transformation from animals and back. I know I should have looked that up. I didn't. They do have meanings. I don't remember what they are, and I did not look them up. I believe it's probably something either related to the animals their parents were, or the fact that, it's probably either related to the animals the parents were, or the red hair, the tall, and the sturdy. Yeah, that fourth one, not my kappa. When I do this as an hour-long class, I gloss that fourth one basically entirely. Yes. Yeah, don't get a Tingith placed on you. They're not good. Also, I like Arian Rod. she's my favorite part of that fourth story. So yes. So yeah, that's a brief, well, relatively brief, glossy, thorough as I can get in 90 minutes overview of the 4 branches of the Mabinogi. You now know the basics of like 80% of Welsh mythology. Good place to find pronunciations. So it depends on if you're going to use modern pronunciations. Oh, sources in general. Sorry, sources, meant to talk about that as a whole. So yeah, pronunciations. I honestly just learned by ear. I learned from my professors. I'm certain that if you Google Middle Welsh pronunciations, that there's a website of some kind. If not, there's a couple of different language revival kind of classes that usually have pronunciations on modern Welsh. I'll dig those up and I'll post them later. Sources in general. So if you're interested in Celtic literature as a whole, I'm going to highly recommend the Celtic Literature Collective. The website, it's not connected to a university or anything. It's maryjones.us. I'm going to stick it in the chat just now. But basically what it is a compendium of texts that this person has found in a whole bunch of different languages. And it's very well organized. You have Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Cornish, I think Breton. You've got a number of different ones. And under each of those categories, she lays out the translation or the original text links on one side. So you have links to all the original texts, and then you have links to the best known translations of all of them. The original text for this is, I use Pedair Canci Mabinogi, the 4 stories of the Mabinogi, as put forth by E4 Williams. That was in 1951. E4 Williams in general is a wonderful scholar of the Mabinogi. I'm going to put that here. That is in Middle Welsh though. And so unless you have a dictionary, yeah, I can't read it straight. I have to use a dictionary. And then for the translations, I use a combination of Siobhán Davies, Nikolai Tolstoy, and oh, who was that third? There's a third one. One sec, let me check. I think it's Parker. Yeah, Parker. William Parker. William Parker. And the translations by William Parker in particular, which again, you can see at that Celtic Literature Collective, they also have footnotes which go into some of the details on the culture and on why things are phrased a certain way. Sorry, Oswin, I know I'm going slightly over.
No worries. I was going to ask if you were ready to be done, but you can continue talking to Loki as you wish.
Oh, it was located in Google Drive. Let me see if it'll let me share it again. The question in the notes was, where's the handout that I posted earlier located? It's mostly just a list of your cast of characters. Along with notes on the 2 sections that have content warnings if you go to search for them on your own. Well, Loki would like to think he's a person in disguise, and he acts more like a dog oftentimes than an actual cat. But he is technically a cat, a 13-pound, very inquisitive large cat. Yes, I'm talking about you. Alrighty, well, thank you. He doesn't believe he's a cat. No, he does not believe he's a cat at all. And he has to be touching me at all times that I'm not actually working. So yeah, touching. Yes, thank you all for coming and for sticking around and for the questions. And it's been a great time. Piece of fur.